hardworking families who don't deserve to be kicked off their health insurance just so billionaires can pay less in taxes. These devastating cuts, by the way, will also close rural hospitals around the country, including in California, where so many are already struggling just to keep the doors open. And for folks listening to the debate thinking that, well, if I'm not on Medicaid, then this may not apply to me, this isn't going to hurt me. Let me remind you that if your local hospital that relies on Medicaid dollars is forced to cut services or cut staff or even close its doors as a result, then yes, you too will be hurt. But the bill doesn't stop there. In this bill, Republicans cut SNAP, nutrition assistance, that critical lifeline that so many count on to literally feed their families. How much more cruel can you get? But wait, there's more. Republicans are also rolling back the historic progress we've made investing in our transition to a clean energy economy, targeting the millions of clean energy jobs that are fueling innovation and helping us stay ahead of China. The cuts to clean energy that Republicans are making in this bill will lead to higher energy costs, higher electricity bills for so many families. Now, I'm reminded that this last November, so many voters went to the polls and voted hoping for lower prices. They were desperate and looking for relief, and that's what motivated their votes. But this bill does the opposite. So I have to wonder, for my Republican colleagues who are supporting this measure, who is it that you're fighting for? Did any of you really come to Congress to take food away from the hungry? To take care away from sick children? What are you proposing be done here? Now, I've seen Republicans go back and forth on this bill for months now, I'm sure trying to decide just how much they can try to get away with. And I've heard some of the arguments that they plan to make to justify voting for this bill. Some of them will argue that we need this bill because we need to reduce the deficit. Talk about misleading. This bill adds trillions, yes, trillions of dollars to our nation's debt. So even when they try to twist the numbers and come up with the funny math, it doesn't even result in deficit reduction. And you know how you can tell? Because the Republicans included a $5 trillion increase to the debt limit in this bill. If the bill and the cuts included in the bill indeed reduce the deficit, as they claim it does, they wouldn't have needed to raise the debt limit in the process. So let's be clear. Republicans who are voting for this bill know full well it will hurt so many of their constituents. That's why behind closed doors you have Republicans handing out flyers that show just how devastating Medicaid cuts will be in states represented by Republicans. Or we hear they're discussing the burden that SNAP cuts will have on state and local governments. But because the leader of their party wants to sign this bill to celebrate the 4th of July this year, many of them will vote yes. But I'll ask again, who is this bill in service of? Who are you standing up for? Who are you fighting for? I'll tell you who I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for people like Jesus da Costa from San Diego, a home care provider who in 2016 because of his mother's full-time, who became his mother's full-time care provider when she was tragically hit by a car and became disabled. Jesus can't hold a full-time job and carry all the responsibilities of looking after his mother. So for both Jesus and his mother, Medicaid has been a lifeline. I'm fighting for him. I'm fighting for people like Tina Ewing Wilson in the Inland Empire, who remembers what it was like the last time her Medicaid benefits were cut. Tina struggles with seizures and developmental disabilities and requires care 24/7. But when the Great Recession hit and Medicaid cuts followed, Tina knew she could only afford her care by offering free room and board to caregivers. Caregivers who went out to abuse drugs and alcohol and took advantage of her financially. Tina's terrified of that possibly happening again if these Republican cuts to Medicaid impact her. I'm fighting for her. And I'm fighting for the families I met at Rady Children's Hospital, where over half of all patients are covered by Medicaid. And I'm fighting for the nurses and the caregivers who fear for their patients. They care for their patients, but they're fearing for their patients because of these proposals. For every parent across the country who's working their tail off to put food on the table for their children, but every now and then may need a helping hand. If you see these Americans, if you have constituents with similar experiences in your state, and still think that they should have less of our help, not more, then I guess we came to Congress for different reasons. If you've seen so many corporations' profits soaring and the wealth inequality in our country growing, and think that billionaires need more tax relief, then I guess we came to Congress for different reasons. And if this week you'll vote to rip these critical lifelines away from millions of Americans because you somehow think it's the right political calculation, then surely we came to Congress for different reasons. Colleagues, it's crystal clear. I urge you to vote no on this bill and stand with me, stand with us, stand up for working families. That's what I plan to do. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Right, and they're still going to get punched in the gut. And it's not just what I hear in person, Mr. President. My office gets hundreds of letters and phone calls every week from Arizonans. People are scared, and they want us to listen. I want to share some of their voices. Frank is a veteran on dialysis. He called this week, and he said, "The food bank and my SNAP benefits are the only way I eat right now. I can't work. I'm not old enough to retire. And I'm dipping into my retirement early just to keep up with my mortgage. Without this help, I don't know what I will do." Mr. President, veterans should never have to say those words in this country. One of the most sacred promises we make to the men and women who serve is that we will take care of them when they return home. That promise doesn't end when they hang up the uniform. It includes making sure that they can afford food, access health care, and live with some dignity. And yet, here's Frank, sick, struggling, and wondering how he'll survive because the programs he relies on are under threat. Cheryl from Tucson, who is a 59-year-old widow, she said, I receive disabled widows benefits, Medicaid, Medicare, and SNAP. Get this. She said, my rent and utilities eat all but about $300 of my monthly income. SNAP and my health care card used to cover most of my food costs. I used to have about $40 left over to buy some extra groceries for the unsheltered in my area. So here's a woman with $40 extra, and she's helping other people. She also says now, buying food for my household takes all of it. I'm scared. If I lose even one of these benefits, I'll lose the grip that keeps the roof over my head. Karen from Scottsdale has worked for over 25 years helping veterans and people with disabilities. She wrote, many of the people I work with rely on Medicaid because they can only work part-time or because their employers don't offer benefits. Cutting them off will just make health care more expensive for everyone. The rich do not need an extension on tax cuts at the expense of low-income and middle-class families. Mr. President, these are my constituents. These are folks who, unprompted, took time to write or call their senator. And every single one of them, Mr. President, is saying the same thing. We're barely holding on, and we're scared this is going to put us over the edge. Now, I wish I could say that these stories were met with compassion by everybody here. But instead, one of my Republican colleagues apparently said, this is a quote, they'll get over it. And another, when asked whether cutting Medicaid would cost lives, said, well, we're all going to die anyway. Now, I didn't come here to throw jabs. I'm repeating those words because they reveal how this budget was written without any connection to the real-world consequences. This isn't about politics. It's about people. So I ask again, what are we doing here? Who do we serve? Is it people like Tara and Cheryl and Crystal and Frank who are working hard and doing everything right to just try to get by? Or is it a bunch of billionaires who've already made it and who don't need another handout? If my colleagues don't believe me, I urge them to go read some of the emails and listen to some of the phone calls that they're getting. Maybe hold a town hall. Listen to those folks. Really, listen to what they are saying. Don't crush their American dream. Don't rig the system even more against them. Don't take a vote just because it's easy. We can do better for the people we serve. Mr. President, they deserve that from us. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Wisconsin.
I rise today in disbelief. You know, it may sound a little cheesy, but at the end of the day, I fundamentally believe in public service. I believe it can be a force for good, a force that gives people opportunity, a force that is people-powered that can lift our neighbors up and instill hope. A force that meets the toughest challenges of our constituents, and that is why I am struck with disbelief. Disbelief because if you believe these things like I do, which I would argue most of my colleagues here do, why would you be jamming this bill through? At a time when Wisconsin families are asking us to take on the high cost of living and let them have a fair shot at success, Republicans are raising costs and making an already unfair tax system even worse. My Republican colleagues are not using their time and energy to go after greedy corporations, not to lower the cost of housing, and not to expand access to affordable health care, but rather they are instead forging ahead with a bill that will kick millions of Americans off their health insurance, jack up prices for care for millions more, and literally take food off the tables of hungry families. Look, I was on the same ballot as Donald Trump last year. I heard the same concerns from my constituents that he did. Families needed some breathing room. My Republican colleagues often say that this president's victory gave him a mandate. Well, then, the president and I got the same mandate: to lower costs and give people the opportunity to live a steady and comfortable life. But in response, the difference could not be more stark. I'm actually working to do something about it. And this bill, the landmark bill from this president and the Republican Party, does just the opposite and will raise costs for families. One of the biggest cost drivers I hear about is health care. And so instead of standing up to big drug companies to lower prescription drug costs, and instead of building on the Affordable Care Act to expand access to health care coverage, this bill actually terminates coverage for Americans. In fact, 17 million Americans will be kicked off either Medicaid or the Affordable Care Act because of this bill. That is like stripping health care coverage from the entire populations of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa combined. And these aren't just numbers. These are people. These are people who have stories, and they matter. I should know, after battling a childhood illness, I became one of those Americans labeled as having a pre-existing health condition. And insurance companies were legally able to deny me coverage. But because of the Affordable Care Act, we changed that. And we gave families like mine hope. Hope that they can get health care at a price they can afford and sleep well at night knowing they have coverage. Medicaid has given that same hope for generations to some of our most vulnerable neighbors. But with this bill, my Republican colleagues are instilling fear. When we talk about Medicaid, we're talking about the elderly, people with disabilities, and children. We're talking about a single mother of 3 who is struggling to make ends meet, and so many more. I have traveled the state of Wisconsin from Superior to Racine, La Crosse to Green Bay, and everywhere in between, to hear from people who will be harmed by this bill. I have come to this very floor to share their stories, to try to help my Republican colleagues understand what this bill will mean. But it's not just the folks who need Medicaid to survive who are sounding the alarm. Take it from Dr. Abigail Wilgruber, a family medical resident in rural Wisconsin. She said this bill, quote, will deprive millions of Americans, particularly children, seniors, and individuals with disabilities, of the care they need to survive. She continued saying, These provisions will limit my ability to complete my job to the fullest, will lead to worse outcomes for patients. Or take it from Rosalanja Burbot, the executive director of an outpatient counseling center in the Fox Valley in Wisconsin, who said, and I quote, "Without Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements, or with reduced rates, our nonprofit will struggle to survive." She continued to say, quote, "I would hate to consider cutting staff or programs, but that could become our only option. We would lose the ability to serve hundreds of clients, not because the need has diminished, but because we could no longer afford to provide care without reimbursement." I have more and more of these stories from doctors, nurses, and administrators on the ground who are spelling out the absolutely dire consequences of this bill. In Wisconsin, we are already in a crisis when it comes to getting good health care in our rural communities. The system is broken, and this bill is destined to make it only worse. While health care is near and dear to my heart, there is more bad news in this bill. Republicans' big betrayal will also take food assistance, the literal means by which some people are able to put nutritious food on the table, away from them. This bill will take SNAP assistance, our nation's best way to make sure that no one goes hungry, away from more than 3 million Americans. And that leads us to the why. Republicans are making all of these cuts so that they can rig our tax code, which I must say already is deeply unfair to working families. And they would further tilt it in favor of the biggest corporations and the richest in our country. The Republican bill gives people at the top 0.1%, the richest of the rich, a tax cut of more than $250,000 every year. Yes, $250,000 a year. All the while, this bill hits working families the hardest. When taking into account the disastrous Medicaid and SNAP cuts, many working families would see their annual incomes fall by over $1,500. And it doesn't have to be this way. Yes, our system for taxes and health care are broken, but this bill is not the solution. This bill would make it harder for working families to have the opportunity to get ahead, harder for parents to get their kids health care, harder for families to put food on the table. We, Democrats and Republicans, should be working together to give some relief to workers, but instead, Republicans will choose to go it alone and vote to give the biggest corporations and the wealthy another unfair leg up. I will end with this. While I remain in disbelief and frankly disgust, I will always have hope. I have hope because it's not the people in this chamber with the power, it's the people. It's the people who will sadly feel the repercussions of this bill. It's the people who are rising up and will hold anyone who passes this disastrous bill accountable. That is where the true power is. And with that, I yield.
Democrats have been on the floor for hours today, pointing out what's in this 1,000-page bill that took over 16 hours to read. I call it the 1,000 pages of pain, the billionaires' gain. So it's bad enough that my colleagues have been on the floor talking about how this bill is going to hurt people on Medicaid, taking food away from our children and families through major cuts to the SNAP program, health care, food, housing, energy support, you name it. The pain is in this bill. But one of the areas that people don't know about is this bill actually has provisions that would take away support for our public schools. Okay, let that sink in. It's not enough that this bill has 1,000 pages of pain in just about every aspect of our lives that you can think of, but now they're coming after support for our public schools. So today, I am rising as an advocate for the 49 million children who are enrolled in public schools across our country. Nearly 90% of K-12 students go to public schools, including 95% of children with disabilities. Yet, we have a regime that is actively working to end federal support for public schools. We have a president who tried to totally eliminate the Department of Education, and sadly for him, he can't do it with through executive order because only Congress can do that, but they're doing a lot of other things that withhold support for public schools. So as Republicans in Congress are trying to undermine support for public schools through the first ever national private school voucher program. Let that sink in. The first ever national private school voucher program. That is taking money away from public schools and basically turning it over to private schools through a voucher program. So let's be clear. The school voucher program, the provision, isn't about money for schools. It's about even more money for billionaires because they're the folks who are going to get the most out of this voucher for public schools program. Under this program, wealthy donors would receive large handouts for supporting school vouchers. So this is why Washington. The Washington Post in their headline, GOP voucher plan would divert billions, $4 billion a year in taxes in perpetuity to private schools. So specifically, the plan would provide a dollar-for-dollar tax credit. We're not talking about tax deductions. We're talking about a tax credit. This is money that comes right off your taxable amount. So what this bill would do is provide a tax credit of $5,000 or 10% of a taxpayer's adjusted gross income, whichever is greater. So a taxpayer making $10 million, we do have people who make $10 million a year, could contribute $1 million and receive a credit for that full amount. How do you like that? You can get $1 million off your tax bill by contributing to this private school voucher program. So rather than calling this plan what it is, and I tell you, the word scam comes to my mind. It's like scamming the public schools. Republicans are deceitfully trying to sell this plan as an expansion of school choice for families. Oh, isn't this voucher program great? More families can send their kids to private school. Here's the reality. Based on what we know about school voucher programs, they do not promote school choice. Let me give you two examples of why this argument does not hold water. For one thing, school vouchers do not cover the full cost of private school tuition. When was the last time anybody thought about how much private schools cost? Maybe, in schools in Hawaii, private schools can cost something in the order of $15,000 to $20,000 a year, starting from kindergarten. A voucher program will not support that full amount. That means that families who want to send their kids to these private schools will have to make up the cost difference. Well, how many middle-income, low-income families would be able to exercise that choice to send their child to a private school that costs that much? And not only that, as we have seen in states that have passed voucher programs, private schools often raise their tuition when they become eligible for vouchers. Iowa is an example. After they approved vouchers in 2022, private schools there increased their prices by over 20% for kindergarten and by over 10% for other grade levels. Here's another example of why this argument that this program promotes choice. There are fewer private schools in rural communities, so many families do not have access to private schools if they live in rural communities. How does this expand choice for these families? The reality is the majority of vouchers have gone to wealthy families and to subsidizing school tuition for students who already attend private schools. Under this bill, Republicans will make that even worse by prioritizing scholarships for these students. I'm going to repeat that because not only is it bad enough that we're going to divert all of this money basically to private schools, but this bill actually has a provision that says the people who will get these scholarships are students who already go to private schools. In Louisiana, for example, now 99% of voucher tax credits there went to families with annual incomes above $200,000. In Virginia, the number was 87% of vouchers in that state going to wealthy families. In Arizona, it was 60%. Americans have consistently rejected school voucher programs and initiatives. Nebraska, Kentucky, and Colorado have all voted against voucher programs within the last year. In Nebraska, school vouchers were put on the ballot last November, and they were soundly defeated for the fourth time. This is not a Democratic or a Republican issue. Nebraska is not a red state. They voted for a Republican president by a 20-point margin, and yet they rejected school vouchers with 57% of the vote. The bottom line is, vouchers take money away from public schools, and Americans of all political stripes understand that. According to All for Ed, over 2/3 of voters would rather increase funding for public schools than increase funding for voucher programs. That is not a new sentiment. In all 17 state referendums on school vouchers since 1967, voters have rejected these programs. While the Republicans in this chamber may not give a rip about public schools, the vast majority of Americans get it. Democrats, Republicans, independents alike support strengthening our public schools, not taking money away from our public schools, because they know that strong public education is fundamental to a strong country. Well, undeterred by public sentiment, Republicans are trying to create, as I mentioned, a nationwide school voucher program. It's not enough that some states have voucher programs, but now the Republicans, through this misguided, almost 1,000 pages of pain bill, they want to provide $4 billion per year for a private school voucher program with no accountability. Remember early on I said that a huge percentage of children with disabilities go to public schools? Well, private schools do not have any responsibility to make sure that they are providing education for children with disabilities. So no accountability. Let's just provide $4 billion per year, perpetuity, tax credit for private school programs that have no accountability along these lines. We all know that this kind of funding could be used for rural and low-income schools, for students with disabilities, for other programs that actually support and strengthen public schools. Instead, under the Republicans' plan, that funding will go to wealthy donors who will receive large handouts, up to $4 billion a year, for supporting school vouchers. Again, this plan will enable a taxpayer making $10 million a year to contribute $1 million and receive a dollar-for-dollar credit for that full amount. And even worse, the taxpayer could contribute appreciated stock and avoid capital gains on the appreciation. And there's all kinds of data on who owns stocks in this country, and generally it's the people with a lot of wealth. So this bill had a provision that enabled people to donate appreciated stock so that they could escape capital gains taxes on that stock contribution totally. So this Republican voucher proposal, outlandish as it is, was briefly delayed after it was deemed non-compliant with budget rules earlier this week. Republicans remained undeterred, and they have decided to plow forward with a nearly identical plan. What it comes down to is this plan does not help students, it does not promote choice, it does not support public schools where the majority of our kids go. We should be supporting our public schools, not taking resources away from them. So my Democratic colleagues and I will continue to fight to fund quality public schools to improve public education in this country. Foundational. This voucher plan is yet another wrong-headed proposal that should be called out for what it is. A handout for the wealthy at the expense of hardworking American families. I urge my colleagues to reject this idea, and I yield back.
In a moral moment in our nation. As we debate this bill, so much is on the line. The health care of over 16 million Americans, 750,000 of them Georgians, is on the line. Food for hungry children. In a wealthy nation where 1 in 5 children are already food insecure. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. Their livelihood, their welfare is on the line. The well-being of seniors in nursing homes and the disabled who rely on Medicaid and those who care for them is on the line. The fate of rural hospitals in Georgia, in Alaska, in Louisiana, and little towns all over this nation that are right now barely hanging on is on the line, and the scraps that they are throwing them while cutting them will not save them. And my friends on the other side of the aisle know it. They know that these scraps that they're throwing at rural hospitals will not save them. And so in a very real sense, lives are on the line. We are in a moral moment because something else is on the line. I submit that the character of the country is on the line. In a real sense, the question tonight is, who are we? Not who do we tell ourselves we are, but who are we really? What and who do we care about? What kind of nation are we? And what kind of people do we want to be? Who matters and who doesn't? Who do we think is dispensable? In no place is the answer to that question clearer than in a nation's budget. I submit that a budget is not just a fiscal document. A budget is a moral document. Show me your budget and I'll show you who you think matters and who doesn't. And if this awful budget were an EKG, it would suggest that our nation has a heart problem and is in need of moral surgery. And so I'm clear tonight. I understand the nature of what we are engaged in. This is a political process. It is. But it is also a moral exercise. Not only for the nation, but for each of us individually. And especially for the mere 100 of us out of a nation of 300 million who get to vote, perhaps in a matter of hours. We have the rare privilege of standing up for people who have entrusted with us the covenant of centering their families. It's a real privilege for the people of your state to say that since we can't all go to Washington, we're going to trust you in rooms of power to be thinking about our children, to be thinking about our parents as they deal with the blessings and the burdens of growing old. And so the question for me tonight is, how will we show up in this moment? And that's why yesterday I gathered in the Russell Rotunda with a multi-faith coalition of clergy to pray that lawmakers might have the courage to stand up to their party, to stand up to the special interests, and protect seniors in nursing homes and pregnant mothers on Medicaid and children who risk going to school hungry every single day in this country. 1 in 5 children in the wealthiest nation on the planet already food insecure. And with these SNAP cuts, this body is about to make it worse. And so, surrounded by a clergy of many faith traditions, yesterday I prayed that we would have the courage. I prayed that we would have the grace to stand as voices for the voiceless. And as I stood there, I could not help but feel a sense of deja vu. This is not the first time I've been in our nation's capital speaking out against these policies that betray hard-working families. It was 8 years ago, almost to the day in 2017, when Washington Republicans were trying to pass a tax bill that favored wealthy Americans over working families, that I came to this building not as a senator, but as a pastor. I had no idea that 8 years later I would be serving in this body. I had no notion that I would even run for the Senate. I came as a citizen. And standing with a multi-faith coalition, we were praying for our nation's leaders. We were gathered in the rotunda of the Russell building, and as we were singing and praying, the Capitol Police said, I'm sorry, pastors, you can't sing and pray in the rotunda. If you do not disperse, we will have to arrest you. And let me say that the Capitol Police did not mishandle us that day. They were first-rate professionals. But they said that if you don't disperse, we will have to arrest you. What they didn't understand is that I had already been arrested. My conscience had been arrested. My heart and my imagination, my moral imagination, had been arrested by this idea that we as a country are better than this. I come from a tradition where you don't just pray with your lips, you pray with your legs. You put your body in the struggle for other struggling bodies. And so here I am tonight, 8 years later, having transformed my agitation into legislation. I was arrested that day, but I have transformed my protests into public policy. 8 years ago, I was on the outside. Tonight, I'm on the inside, but it's the same fight. Some of us fight on the inside, some of us fight on the outside, some of us get to serve in the Senate or in the House, others are just watching at home tonight, but be really clear that we are in the same fight, whether we are on the streets or in the suites. Same fight. And in some ways, this is the same bill 8 years later, just worse. Like most horror movies, the sequel tends to be worse. We were here 8 years ago. Washington politicians were trying their best to gut the Affordable Care Act. Remember that? They were trying to gut the Obamacare out of political motives. Millions of Americans were spared. But tonight is the sequel to that horror movie. They are back to their old political tricks, trying to dismantle the ACA again with this legislation. It's the same fight, just worse this time. Instead of extending tax credits that would lower health insurance costs for the middle class, my friends on the other side are giving billionaires and the richest of the rich a tax cut. They are working real hard tonight to help billionaires because God knows they are having a hard time, apparently. And what that means is that 1.2 million Georgians and nearly 20 million Americans are going to see their health care premiums rise. That's what's at stake tonight. If they enact these deep cuts to Medicaid, as they are positioned not to extend these premiums, these tax credits, they are raising the cost of health care for all of us. Even if you are on private insurance, you are not safe. Your health care is about to go up. Your hospital might close because they're cutting these clean energy tax cuts. Your utility bills are about to go up. And so I have a question tonight. Who voted for that? Some of us are Democrats, some of us are Republicans, some of us are independents, some voted for one party, some voted for the other party. I get it, but who voted for that? Who voted for everybody's health care premiums to go up and their hospitals to close? Here's what I know. The folks back in Georgia didn't vote for that. They voted for me and they voted for Donald Trump, but they didn't vote for that. Ordinary folks don't want this. Just ordinary, everyday people who barely pay attention to politics They don't want this. Even a Fox News poll, and you won't often hear me say that, but even a Fox News poll from this month found that Americans don't support this big, ugly bill. This is symptomatic of the ways in which the people's voices have been squeezed out of their democracy. This is not just a healthcare fight, it is that. It is not just a fight for food security, for SNAP, it is that. But in the real sense, it is a fight for our democracy, whose voice gets to be heard in this chamber. That's what this is about, the character of the country. Ordinary Americans don't want to do this to our children. That's why they need to know that 71% of all Medicaid enrollees in Georgia are children. 71%. Taking away health care from kids to pay for tax cuts for billionaires. Now, let me be clear. I'm all for tax cuts. I believe working families deserve a tax cut, and I certainly don't want to see them face a tax hike this year. That's why I want to nearly double the child tax credit. I believe in tax cuts for hardworking families, for middle-class people, for working-class families. But instead of doing that, instead of helping working-class families who are struggling now against a 10% tax on everything and rising costs, we're now burdening our children by adding $3 trillion to the debt. We're taking away health care from kids and then burdening them with the debt. We are engaged in Robin Hood in reverse, this body of stealing from the poor in order to give to the rich. This massive transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top. Yeah, this is socialism for the rich. And when the people hear about it, guess what? They don't like it. Democrats and Republicans and independents, when the people hear about what's in this big ugly bill, they don't like it. And that's why the folks on the other side are trying their best to fast track it. That's why they're trying to pass it, and they haven't even finished writing it. They're twisting themselves in knots, making their members walk the plank under the threat of a primary to pass this big, ugly bill. The American people do not want to rob our children of food and health care and then burden them with trillions in debt to give billionaires and wealthy corporations another tax cut. The people do not want this bill. And so if the people do not want this bill, but they are trying to pass it, here's the question you got to ask yourselves at home. You have to ask yourselves, well, who are they working for? Who are they fighting for? Who do they think matters? Do you think they are working for you? This is a moral moment, and a budget is a moral document. And we have been summoned to this moment, people of faith and people of moral courage who claim no particular faith at all. And maybe because I was here yesterday and 8 years ago for a similar fight with faith leaders, maybe because I'm a preacher and it's Sunday, and I've been here instead of church, I have especially been thinking about those of us who are people of faith. People whose lives are informed by Scripture, people of the book. And maybe those of us who have different politics but read from the same book ought to spend some time together reading the book. Because I do sometimes wonder, and I say this with all humility, none of us owns the truth. But if I'm honest, there are days when I have to ask people of my faith tradition as a Christian, are we reading the same book? The book I know says, I was hungry and you fed me. I was sick, I was in prison and you visited me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it also unto me. The book that I love says, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of the destitute. Speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. My book says, whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord and will be repaid in full. The prophet Amos condemns those who buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They sell the poor out and working class people for cheap. And for those of us who have a vote in this moment, for my colleagues who are swinging on a moral dilemma, I hear the prophet Micah say, he has already told you what is good. And what does the Lord require? But that you do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. May God be with our nation and grant us grace, wisdom, and courage for this moment. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Madam President, first I want to thank my colleagues, and especially just now my colleague from Georgia, for their work tonight, for their expression of what's at stake in this moment, and to Senator Warnock, I say thank you and amen. I'm here today because I'm joining the majority of Americans who are deeply alarmed by this plan from the president and his congressional allies, a plan that will make life less affordable for more Americans. When we return home for this 4th of July, it'd be nice to be able to tell our constituents that we came together and passed bipartisan legislation to help bring down costs for families. Instead, my colleagues who vote for this legislation will have to explain why, at a time when families' pocketbooks are strained, they chose to support a partisan bill to make American life even less affordable. What will America look like once this bill takes effect? Millions of people will have lost their health coverage, thanks to the largest cut to Medicaid in American history. More people won't be able to afford preventive care and cancer screenings, and more people will get sick. Healthcare premiums will surge for everyone because fewer people will have care and the number of uninsured Americans will increase. Rural hospitals will close their doors because they lost Medicaid reimbursements that help keep them afloat. More people, especially in states like mine, will have to make long car rides just to get to a hospital 50 miles away in those desperate moments when minutes feel like hours and hours like eternities. Seniors will be thrown into grave peril because this bill threatens hundreds of billions in Medicare cuts. And once this plan eviscerates food assistance programs, it will be much harder for families to afford to put food on the table at a time when groceries are already far too expensive. Let there be no mistake. More families and children who today are being fed will go hungry. And all the while, our children will be burdened with trillions more in debt. In the name of what cause is all this done? Well, it's all to pay for tax breaks for billionaires. This bill will also make us an America where our people are less free. In New Hampshire, during my time as governor, we adopted Medicaid expansion with support from both political parties, and we balanced the budget at the same time. We understood that with health comes freedom, the freedom to work and provide for one's family, the freedom from disease and despair, the freedom that comes from, why do I even have to say this, being alive. Granite Staters also understood that a great country like ours treats its people with great dignity. In America, we don't sacrifice the health of our neighbors, we don't let families fall sick, and we do not imperil our economy, our debt, and our workforce just to pay for a tax giveaway for a billionaire. So what kind of country will we be with this bill? We will not only be less healthy, but we will be less prosperous and less free. In short, this bill is at odds with what we aspire to be as Americans. It's also worth noting how remarkably out of step this bill is with the American people's plea to bring down costs. In a democracy like ours, theoretically, the people's representatives pass legislation that reflects the aspirations of the majority. I say theoretically because clearly that is not what is happening today. Indeed, according to the data from the Joint Economic Committee minority, if one combines this bill with the president's tariffs, firefighters, truck drivers, and teachers, for instance, will lose $470 or more next year, while the top 0.1%, that's people who earn about $4 million or more, will be $348,000 richer. This bill would take away health care from tens of thousands of Granite Staters and would take a similar toll across the country. Indeed, in both Florida and Texas, the number of people who will lose their health insurance is greater than the entire population of New Hampshire. Millions of people losing care with a stroke of a pen. What have these people done to deserve that? All the American people are asking for is for us to help bring down costs. So the president and the Republicans in Congress take away their health care? Sometimes in Washington, we're faced with bills that fail to fully meet the moment, to be sure. But it is rare to find legislation like this, a bill that makes life less affordable during a time when Americans of every political stripe are crying out for lower costs. A bill that seems as if it was drafted just to make a mockery of the wills and wishes of the majority of people in this country. Lately, many of my colleagues and some political pundits have been talking about this bill as if it were inevitable, a runaway freight train so vast that it cannot be stopped. And in light of this inevitability, they suggest that some of the bill's deficiencies can just be overlooked. But of course, this bill was not inevitable, nor is it now. So let's be clear. Each and every senator in this body has free will, God-given free will, which means that the measures in this legislation that gut Medicaid weren't written by mistake or by chance. We didn't arrive at this day with a vote on this terrible budget bill by accident. Let's not delude ourselves. We're only here because a majority in this body decided to ignore the majority of the country and made a series of decisions. The Republican majority decided to gut Medicaid. They decided to take away health care from millions. They decided to raise insurance premiums for the rest of us. They decided that closed hospitals were a risk worth taking. They decided that taking food away from hungry kids was acceptable. They decided that trillions more in debt was not a problem. The Republican majority decided that depriving the American people of all these things and raising their costs were worth it, just as long as they paid for another tax break for billionaires. Because that's the bargain that this administration, along with my Republican colleagues, is forcing the American people to accept. Our people will be less healthy, our kids will have more debt, but the president and billionaires like him will get a tax break. Of course, part of what makes this bill so frustrating is that it includes some individual provisions that I've spent years trying to pass into law. This bill includes provisions I support, some even that I authored, like strengthening the R&D tax deduction to support our entrepreneurs and a tax cut for families to make child care more affordable. I also support this bill's provisions which would tackle our housing crisis by expanding the low-income housing tax credit to bring down the cost of housing, as well as a provision making mortgage insurance tax deductible so that it's easier to buy a home. And I'd support a bill with real tax cuts for the middle class and small businesses, unlike the token measures included in this bill. If my Republican colleagues worked across the aisle to draft a bill that brought this bipartisan approach to other critical areas, like health care and food assistance, I'd vote for it. Instead, my colleagues chose to take these common sense solutions hostage by linking every good idea to 3 bad ones, turning this into a purely partisan endeavor. So yes, I'm glad that some of these bipartisan provisions will be signed into law, but I regret that they aren't a part of a truly bipartisan effort because of the politics of division and destruction that President Trump brings to Washington. Now, I know that there are many areas of common ground with my Republican colleagues in this body, but it has become far too difficult to move forward on finding solutions when at every turn the president seems far more interested in demonizing and dividing rather than bringing people together, turning areas of agreement into weapons to force disagreement. Now that's exactly the kind of cynical politics of division that does lasting damage to our families, our economy, and our democracy. Now, President Trump likely will get this bill passed. He may get enough of the Republican caucus to stand in line once again to pass it, even though my Republican colleagues know that budget analysts have added up the financial cost of this bill and have told them that it adds trillions upon trillions to our national debt, burdening our children's future. But you know, as important as the debt is, it's not the only cost of passing this awful bill. There's another kind of cost, a cost not simply of dollars and cents. I shouldn't have to remind this administration and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about the nature of this cost. They know it. But just to be clear, this tax break for corporate special interests and billionaires has a price that can't be summed up in a budget line or written off during tax season. Because when we debate health care in America, some dress up these discussions with words like reconciliation and program and discretionary spending. But what they're talking about is being sick and being healthy. What they're talking about, whether they want to admit it or not, is living and dying. So how much does this bill cost? The cost is millions of Americans losing their health care. The cost is countless families feeling the pain of higher insurance premiums. The cost is a mother being forced to choose between paying out of pocket for her own care or paying for groceries for her kids. It's a price that's exacted in cancers that go undetected. It's exacted in chronic illnesses that go untreated. It's exacted in the healthcare challenges in our country that continue to go unaddressed because we spend all our energies simply trying to keep our heads above water in floods of the president's own making. The price tag is more than dollars and cents. It includes the cost of losing more people from our workforce because they're too ill to work. It includes the gnawing pains of hunger and the slow toll of malnutrition that will come as food assistance programs are robbed. It includes the anguish of young parents no longer knowing how they will make ends meet. It includes the lost hopes and deferred dreams of people held back by illness. It includes the cost of having to say more early goodbyes. What is the price tag of this bill? The price, in the end, is the health and freedom of millions of Americans, a price that will be paid because somewhere on the road that brought us here in President Trump's Washington, some people decided that the health of some child or her mother may be dear, but it doesn't carry the same weight as a bigger tax return for a billionaire does. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam President. And the hour is late. I want to thank the presiding officer for being here. I'm glad to be here with my colleagues from New Hampshire and my neighbor from New Mexico. I want to thank the floor staff that's here tonight. And I would like to suggest, this is not the purpose of my speech, but the next time that senators make the suggestion that the floor staff should spend the entire night reading a bill here, that the senators actually read that bill instead of imposing that on the staff that's here. I think that would be a just thing for us to do and the appropriate and proper thing for us to do. Madam President, the last time that we were headed down this road, when Republicans were passing President Trump's 2017 deficit exploding tax cut, it didn't take a mathematical genius to figure out what was about to happen. I told the Senate at that time, as our debt grows, we will spend billions more, not on schools, roads, and innovation, but on interest costs. Worse, we're about to blow another hole in the debt without really helping the middle class. 8 years ago, I said, on top of that, we know that when deficits swell, as they surely will, cuts to Medicaid and Medicare are sure to follow. Further burdening working families struggling to make ends meet. Well, here we are. That's exactly the story of this bill. Utterly predictable. This bill, which massively increases our deficit when our children can least afford it. The Republican senators passing this bill tonight or tomorrow morning, if they do, know they're doing it when we have already hit a new milestone for the first time in American history. Our interest payments, Madam President, exceed the amount that we spend on our national defense. For the first time, the American people, because of the irresponsibility in this chamber, are going to pay $1 trillion in interest. That is a massive number. That is essentially the same as what we spend on Medicare, what we spend on children and higher education together, what we spend on housing, bridges, broadband, ports, and highways combined. I want to be very clear tonight that over the years, Democrats and Republicans have pursued policies that have led to that $1 trillion in interest payments. There is no doubt about it. And it's worth thinking about what we could do if we hadn't made such fiscally irresponsible choices. Expand the child tax credit, as my colleague from Georgia said. and cut childhood poverty in half and hunger by a quarter. Build a modern energy grid to meet our expanding energy demands so Americans in cities and rural communities can enjoy affordable, reliable energy at home. Establish a healthcare system that the American people deserve, a modern system that people in other rich industrialized countries take for granted. A system that does not cost twice as much with worse outcomes, like in the United States of America, the richest country in the world, that forces parents to choose between their children's prescriptions and school supplies, that exhausts the American people who day after day after day have to fight endless negotiations with their insurance companies just to keep their children covered, that constantly threatens rural hospitals and clinics with closure in this country. No other rich country in the world puts up with that craziness. And we're spending twice as much as any other country in the world to get worse health care, worse outcomes, more scarcity. Every senator on this floor might make a different choice about the policies that they would enact, their preferred policies. But I doubt, Madam President, there is anybody here who is willing to go home and defend the virtues of wasting $1 trillion of the American people's money on interest payments. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and outside groups like the Penn Wharton Budget Lab tell us that by the end of the next 10 years, we will have the highest debt ratio ever, eclipsing the debt our nation had in the 1940s. What was happening in the 1940s? That's when the greatest generation had borrowed money to defeat economic misery at home through the New Deal and European fascism by becoming the arsenal of democracy. Those were their receipts. Those were the receipts of a generation that understood its commitment to the next generation, to us. When we contemplate from this broken Senate the patriotic accomplishments of the greatest generation, what has always seemed particularly egregious to me have been the tax policy Republicans have passed 4 times since Ronald Reagan passed it in 1981. Every single time they made the same promises. Every time. Look it up. They made the same promises that their trickle-down tax policy would drive economic growth, cut our deficit, pay for themselves. Every time, including the recent Trump tax cut in 2017, these promises have been false. They have been false. That was 8 years ago. That wasn't a century ago. We know what the math is. Everybody in this room knows the deficit is far worse today than it was when Donald Trump passed those tax cuts. President Trump has had a very rare thing happen, which is he got to take 4 years off and come back and be president. The effect of the tax cuts he passed the last time that he said we're going to pay for themselves clearly have not. There's nobody in this chamber who can deny that. I always find it amazing when I hear these promises, why people make them if they know they're so false, over and over and over again. And I think the reason is, Madam President, that it is a way that politicians in Washington can avoid the objections that you could never get away with at home. Imagine for a minute if there were a mayor in America, any mayor, in any town, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, or in Lyman, Colorado, or in Los Angeles, California. It doesn't matter, Republican town or a Democratic town. Imagine if a mayor came to you, Madam President, and said, this town is going to borrow more money than we have ever borrowed before. That would worry you, that would worry me. And I think our first question would be to that mayor, okay, that worries me. What are you going to spend the money on that you're borrowing? Are you going to spend it on schools? No. Are you going to spend it on parks? No. Are you going to spend it on the water infrastructure that so many communities in New Mexico requires? Are you going to spend it on the mental health crisis that our teenagers are facing because of our failure to address it? Are you going to spend it on infrastructure? And the answer to all those questions would be no. What are you going to spend the money on, Mr. Mayor? Well, the answer is I am going to give tax cuts to the 2 richest neighborhoods in town and hope that those trickle down to everybody else. That is the Republican tax policy. There's a reason why no mayor in America has ever done that. There is no mayor in America who has ever pursued trickle-down economics, because you would get run out on a rail. You would get run out on a rail if you went and said, we are going to borrow the most money that has ever been borrowed from our children to finance tax cuts for the richest neighborhoods in town. It makes no sense. It is preposterous. And yet that has been the argument since Ronald Reagan first said these tax cuts will be paid for. The economy will grow. There won't be a deficit. There's a reason we're paying more than $1 trillion in interest today, and that's because our deficits are enormous. Fortunately, and this is really important for the American people to understand, we still live in the strongest country in the world. We are in the world's richest economy. We have the most lethal military. Apart from our president, we have a national commitment to an independent judiciary, the rule of law, and low levels of corruption in our economy and in our society. We have unparalleled capital markets, cutting-edge innovation, and world-leading universities. We have all those things going for us, partly because the folks that came before us invested in those things and built those things and tended those things. But what we struggle with in our time is a sense among most Americans that they can't get ahead, that the American dream is farther and farther out of reach for themselves and for their family. And in my view, that is the biggest challenge our country faces. And in the face of this bill's ill-considered tax cuts to our health care, and in the face of this bill's ill-considered tax cut and cuts to our health care system, which is going to throw millions of people off their health care and make health care more expensive for everybody else. By the way, what's the logic of that? The logic of that is that when you throw people off their health care, they end up going to the emergency room to take care of themselves and take care of their families, just as anybody would. That's the most expensive care that anybody could have. That expense is then put into our insurance, in our insurance policies, and all of us are going to pay more. You can't wish away people just because you throw them off health insurance. when other countries in the world, other wealthy, rich countries in the world, have a system of insurance that basically guarantees health care and mental health care to their citizens. It's worth asking why we would throw our people off the not so great health insurance that they have. That's a good question. But it's particularly crazy when it just drives up the cost for everybody else. We need to deeply think about the challenges that our country is facing today. It's more unequal. The top 1% owns 30% of our nation's wealth, Madam President, and the bottom 50% owns 2.5%. The top 1% of Americans own 50% of the value of the stock market. The top 1% of Americans own 50% of the value of the stock market, while the bottom 50% owns just 1% of its value. Something that's really affecting my state is the nation's median home price is now 5 times higher than median family income. And as a result, the average first-time homebuyer is now 38 years old. Madam President, 38 years old versus 29 just a generation ago. Reading scores in our nation have hit a 20-year low. And perhaps most damning and perhaps most upsetting is that our lifespan has declined since the 1980s. We are now on average likely to die 6 years shorter than other people that live in wealthy countries around the world. If you're African American, your chance of dying is on average 12 years sooner than people living in the industrialized world. If we don't shift course soon, Madam President, we will be the first generation of Americans whose kids and grandkids will be worse off than we are. That has never happened before. We are on track for that to happen to our children. Many young people today can't afford to live on their own, and they may never be able to afford a house. They can't afford health care or child care. They can't count on a quality education for their children in too many parts of America. Some are really worried about whether they're going to be able to afford a child at all. If you haven't heard a family say that to you in your town halls or in your meetings, you haven't been paying attention. But instead of addressing any of these challenges, we are debating a bill tonight that will make the wealthiest Americans even wealthier and the poorest Americans even poorer, 500,000 of whom live in Colorado, while adding millions more to the debt which working Americans are going to have to pay back. That's what this Republican trickle-down economics comes down to. No matter how you dress it up, that's what it comes down to. Our generation has made some very bad choices when it comes to our children's future. This bill only makes matters worse for them. And all this debt will constrain the choices that they are going to be able to make for themselves. And that's a shame, Madam President. Because unlike us, perhaps they will aspire to following in the footsteps of the greatest generation to build a country where lifespans are growing, not falling, where economic mobility is rising, where poverty and economic anxiety are falling, where energy exports are increasing and emissions are decreasing, where quality health care and child care, education, and affordable housing are abundant, not scarce. It seems obvious to me, Madam President, that our child's ambition should be ours as well. Unfortunately, tomorrow, the Republican majority may pass a bill that takes us further in the wrong direction. In its wake and in its wreckage, Americans who do feel an obligation to the next generation are going to have to fight even harder to fulfill our duty. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Senator from California.
Madam President, today we meet at the center of a great debate, at a crossroads that will determine the direction of the country for another generation. And this debate, this choice, goes to the heart of a central question that has been plaguing families in America over the last 3 decades, but that is now just coming to the forefront. And that question is this: if you are working hard in America, can you still earn a good living for yourself and your family? If you are working hard in America, can you still buy a home or pay your rent, buy your food and medicine, get the health care you need, afford fuel for your car, get a decent education, or go on a family vacation? And if the answer is no, and for all too many millions of people the answer is no, what do we do about it? When I was a kid, my father was in the clothing business. He was a traveling salesman and he made $18,000 a year. On the strength of that single income, my parents bought our first home for $18,000. He made $18,000 a year and he bought a home. My parents bought a home for $18,000. It was the American dream and it came true for our family. Today I'm a U.S. Senator. That too is part of the American dream, that anything is possible in this country. But could anyone buy a home for the cost of the annual income even of a U.S. Senator? Not a chance in the world. An average home in California costs 3 or 4 times that much. My kids are paying thousands and thousands of dollars a month in rent. Could they find a home for the cost of their annual income? There is even less of a chance of that. And what about your grandkids? At the rate we are going, at the rate housing prices are rising, what chance will they have to afford a home at any income? And of course, it's not just a home. Healthcare costs are rising even faster. Millions of families are only one healthcare crisis away from failing. And it's not their fault. It's not their fault. They are working hard, harder than ever, and they can't keep pace with rising premiums, out-of-pocket costs, hospital stays, drug costs, and charges at the emergency room. Energy prices are going up. It costs more to heat your home in the winter and a lot more to cool your home in the summer. Utility bills have been rising by double digits, while incomes have remained comparatively flat. It's too much. It's too much. Now, why is this coming to a head now? Why, when we're not in a Great Depression, not even a Great Recession, although with Trump's destructive tariff wars, we may get there soon enough, why now? Why now is this coming to a head? And the answer is that people feel more squeezed than ever, more pressure than ever, more like a failure than ever because they're doing their best, working their hardest, and they are still hanging by a thread. And you know something? It's not their fault. It's not their fault. They are doing everything they can to provide for their families, and it's just not enough. It's not their fault, but it is someone's fault. It is someone's responsibility. There is someone who should be held accountable for the fact that this generation is the first to renege on a compact between generations that we would leave the country better off to the next generation than the one that came before. And you know who that someone is? It is us. It is us. The world has changed, the nature of work has changed, and we have not changed with it. We have not kept pace, and in too many ways, through our policy failures, we have moved the country in the wrong direction. And the question before us today is whether we continue to barrel down that track towards higher home prices, bigger health care costs, more hunger and greater hardship, or whether we change direction. Much too late, yes, requiring an even more profound course correction, certainly, but finally steer this country to a better quality of life for all of our citizens. Is this bill that change in direction? Does it lead our country on a new path towards affordability and prosperity? And the answer, the simple, terrible, but clear as day answer is no. It most emphatically does not. No, it does nothing to bring down costs. No, it does nothing to make it easier for your kids or mine to buy a house, pay their rent, buy groceries, afford their medicine, or fill up the car for a family vacation. Instead, it throws more coal in the engine, barreling down a track to nowhere. Donald Trump promised he wouldn't cut Medicaid. But this bill cuts hundreds of billions of dollars from Medicaid. It is shredding the president's commitment made again and again. In January, the president said Republicans will love and cherish Medicaid. In February, he said, we're not going to touch it. Even a few weeks ago, the president said, we're not changing Medicaid, we're leaving it. But we see in the black and white in this text they released in the dark of night that simply isn't true. This bill will result in millions losing their health care from cuts to Medicaid. We know that. The Republicans know that. Thom Tillis has made this point over and over again tonight, as have other Republicans in this body. This bill will close down hospitals in the poorest counties and states. It will raise health care costs for families everywhere and by the thousands of dollars. It takes food away from the hungry. It kills clean energy so that we have to rely on oil and gas for everything, enriching that industry and impoverishing the rest of us with higher prices at the pump. It raises taxes on working families and the middle class while lowering taxes on the very wealthy and corporations. If you are in the top 0.1% of income earners making more than $5 million a year, you will get a $346,000 tax cut. How is that fair? How is that right? And it borrows the money from our kids to pay for that $346,000 tax cut, to pay for the habits of really rich people. Where is the fairness, the morality in that? When is enough enough? My father was part of the greatest generation. We, it would appear, are part of the most selfish. And I'm fed up with it. I'm fed up with it. What happened to any sense of responsibility in this generation? What happened to love of country? Can we love our country and impoverish it? Can we love our children and grandchildren if we take from them only to give to ourselves? In this bill, we borrowed trillions from our kids. And for what? So the rich can have a bigger boat? So corporate CEOs can have more money? So a company can buy back more of its stock? So we can be richer than our neighbor while his neighbor has no home at all? The test of our progress, Franklin Roosevelt said in 1937, is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. Last week, a landscaper in Los Angeles was tackled to the ground because he was undocumented. He's the father of 3 Marines. 3 Marines. When one of those Marines was finally able to speak to his father after his detention, he had one ask of his son: please go back to the work site and finish the job. That was his ask. That is the work ethic that has made this country great, not the ethic that brought him to the ground. Raising 3 Marines, that is the patriotism that has made this country great, not the rancor that beat him while he lay there. But if this bill is not the answer, and it most certainly is not, if this bill only makes matters worse, far worse, then what is the answer? What direction shall we go? How can we begin to make the country work for people once again? Well, we can give instead of take. We can build instead of tear down. We can recapture once again the sense of possibility in this country. If Eisenhower was part of the generation that won the war and built the roads and highways, let us be the generation that wins the peace by creating the next giant boom in housing in America, making the investment necessary, tapping into the great potential of the government and industry working together, breaking down each obstacle in the way, millions and millions of new homes that my children can afford and your children. Let us build new hospitals instead of closing them down, and in so doing, bring the cost of health care down with them. Let us train new doctors and nurses so it is not so expensive to visit them, and new home health care workers to take care of us even as we take care of them. Let us grow more food and feed more people at home and abroad and bring down the cost of our groceries. Let us thank our farm workers instead of chasing them through the fields to separate them from those they love. None of this is beyond our capacity. It may mean that we can't afford yet another tax break for the wealthy, or a giveaway to the oil industry, or a giveaway to any other industry and its corporate titans. It may call for some sacrifice on our part, but a fraction of what our parents and grandparents gave to this country. It means that we pay more attention to our kids and their needs and less our own, that we once again show concern and compassion for our neighbor, and remember that we were once strangers in a strange land, that we show humility about our own achievements and recognize that none of us got here on our own, that all of us can prosper without someone else being made to suffer. You know, the way it used to be, the way it could be once again. Madam President, I yield back.
Madam President.
The senator from New Mexico.
President, I've heard several of my colleagues speak tonight about what this bill means for Americans all across America. Now, each of us has a responsibility to ask whether this bill meets the needs of the people that we're honored to serve. Now, I grew up on a small farm, as many of you know, working the land, caring for animals, sometimes even cleaning barns. And I can tell you, this bill does not pass the smell test. For New Mexicans, hardworking people, this bill does not help our families get ahead. New Mexicans work hard. Folks are not looking for a
Senate will come to order. Chaplain Dr. Black will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, you have been our help in ages past. You are our hope for the years to come. You are our shelter from the stormy blast. You are our eternal home. Lord, today keep our lawmakers from being so busy and weary that they have no time to listen to your voice. Keep them from permitting the voice of their desires to make them deaf to your word. Lord, keep us all from sometimes forgetting that your commands are meant for us and your promises are true. We pray in your marvelous name. Amen.
Thank you. Will you please join me in the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible,